Vivian Blackthorne fired Rhett Dawson in front of the entire production floor because he walked in 47 minutes late on the most critical morning the company had seen in a decade. The single father didn't argue, didn't plead. He unclipped his badge and set a scorched component on her desk with the quiet precision of a man who had done far more that morning than anyone in the room knew. Seconds after the gate closed behind him, the floor manager came running, face pale. "You just fired the man who spent all night fixing your Ferrari." Vivienne turned to the window just as the engine turned over, clean, smooth, and silent as an accusation. The component Rhett left behind wasn't evidence of a repair. It was evidence of something far worse. Stay until the end to find out who sabotaged that Ferrari and why Rhett was fired before he ever had the chance to speak. The morning that changed everything at Blackthorne Velocity Motors began the way every high-stakes morning does, with people moving faster than they should, saying less than they meant, and holding their breath against outcomes they couldn't fully control. The Technical Center in Westbridge, Michigan hummed with a particular kind of tension, the kind that lives in fluorescent light and pressed collars and the sound of expensive heels on concrete floors, because Vivian Blackthorne had arrived before anyone else, and when the CEO arrived before anyone else, it never meant good news. She had three things on her mind as she walked the floor. The international partners flying in to finalize a $300 million collaboration. The board members who had been quietly circling her leadership since a prototype failure the previous week, and the 1963 Ferrari 250 GT Lusso that her late father had driven to every major milestone of his life, and which she had planned to drive herself to the signing ceremony that afternoon. The Ferrari had been brought in the night before with an engine fault nobody could fully explain. A low rumble in the power delivery that felt wrong in a way that was hard to quantify but impossible to ignore. And when Vivienne asked what the status was, her floor manager Malcolm Whitaker told her it had been handled, that a man had stayed through the night, and that the car would be ready. What Vivienne did not know, and what nobody had told her yet, was exactly who that man was, and exactly what he had given up to make that car run clean by morning. Rhett Dawson walked through the main entrance at 7:47. 47 minutes after his scheduled shift, wearing a shirt that hadn't been ironed, eyes that hadn't been closed, and the particular stillness of someone who has already done a full day's work before breakfast. He moved through the floor without rushing, without excuses, and without any sign that he understood the silence forming around him. The way heads turned and conversations dropped, and hands paused over clipboards. Vivian Blackthorne saw him from across the floor and felt something she rarely allowed herself at work. The cold, quiet certainty of being disrespected, not in a loud or obvious way, but in the most insulting kind, the kind that assumes you won't notice or won't act. She had been awake since 5 in the morning, carrying the weight of a deal that could preserve 300 jobs and position Blackthorne among the top independent performance manufacturers in North America. And a man who had worked there for 6 years had decided that this particular morning, of all mornings, was a fine time to walk in nearly an hour late. She met him in the middle of the floor, where everyone could see because she had learned early in her tenure that allowing one violation to pass unaddressed in private was an invitation for a dozen more to follow in public. She asked him directly and without warmth why he was late. Rhett looked at her with the expression of a man calculating whether an explanation would be received. And something about the crowd gathering behind her, the partners arriving within hours, and the way this moment felt already decided told him it wouldn't, that whatever he said would be weighed against the optics of tardiness on the worst possible day and found wanting. So he said the only thing that felt true without being a justification: "I finished what needed to be done." It was not the answer Vivienne was looking for, and it landed exactly as she feared it would. like arrogance dressed in calm clothes. Laurel Winslow, the HR director, stepped forward at that moment with a tablet, noting quietly that the overnight shift system showed no record of Rhett logging after-hours work, and that the previous evening's schedule reflected him clocked out at his regular time. Vivian asked whether this was the first time he had treated his hours as optional. Rhett said he had not been late once in 6 years. She said a clean record did not erase the morning standing in front of her. The termination was immediate and public, delivered in the measured, controlled tone Vivian used whenever she needed a decision to feel final. Rhett did not argue, did not raise his voice, did not ask for a second conversation. He unclipped his employee badge and set it on the nearest surface, handed over his tool locker key with the same hand he would have used to pass a wrench, and then reached into his jacket pocket and placed a small, scorched component on the corner of her desk, a piece of something, blackened at one edge, with a production marking barely visible along its casing, and said, without looking at anyone in particular, that Malcolm would understand what it was. Then he walked toward the exit with the even, measured pace of someone who had decided the conversation was over before it was offered. Nobody stopped him. Nobody called after him. The floor stayed quiet until the sound of the outer gate had faded, and then the silence was broken not by Vivienne but by Malcolm Whitaker, who came through the far bay doors at a jog and looked at the termination form in Laurel's hand the way a man looks at a bill for something he'd already paid. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He stood in the middle of that floor and said, with the kind of steadiness that only people who have nothing to gain from lying can manage, "You just fired the man who spent all night fixing your Ferrari." Vivienne did not move. Malcolm picked up the component Rhett had left behind, turned it in his fingers, and said with equal quietness, "And this was not the part on that car when it left the factory." The night before had begun at 6:53 in the evening when the Ferrari was rolled into the main service bay on a flatbed, its engine throwing a sound that Malcolm described as off in a way that would scare you on a highway. Vivienne had been clear. The car needed to run by 8 the following morning because she intended to drive it herself, in full view of the international partners, as a statement about the company her father had built and the legacy she intended to honor. Most of the technical staff had already gone home. The ones who remained were junior technicians who knew performance engines in the way a student knows a textbook. Enough to recite the principles, not enough to hear the problem. Malcolm called Rhett because Rhett was the only person on the floor that night who had spent years working performance vehicles before coming to Blackthorn, who had once served as a calibration engineer on endurance race teams before he left that world behind for something slower and more stable, and who could diagnose a misfiring system by the interval between pulses in a way that was more art than procedure. Rhett had been gathering his things to leave when the call came, already mentally calculating the pickup time for his daughter Mila, who was 13 and accustomed to her father's hours, but never fully comfortable with uncertainty. He arranged for a relative to cover the evening, confirmed the arrangement twice, and came back to the bay with the quiet, settled focus that everyone who had ever worked alongside him recognized as the signal that the problem was about to get solved. He worked through it systematically, starting at the ignition system, following the timing chain, checking the distributor cap, tracing every wire in the firing sequence. And what he found, piece by piece over the next several hours, was not the kind of failure that happens when an old car is left unattended too long. The spark plugs were burning uneven because the firing signal was wrong, not weak, but wrong, often a pattern that didn't match wear or age, and the distributor had contact marks inconsistent with normal use. A sensor had been fitted into the intake assembly that had no business being there. A modern component hidden behind original hardware, wired into the signal path in a way that someone had clearly taken time to conceal. Malcolm looked at what Rhett had found and suggested, with the careful optimism of a man who prefers simple explanations, that a previous technician might have made the substitution without documentation. Rhett didn't argue the point, but he turned the component over in his fingers for a long time without saying anything, because the replacement hadn't been made hastily or carelessly. It had been made cleanly, precisely, by someone who understood the system well enough to hide what they'd done inside it. He finished the repair by restoring the original configuration as closely as the available parts allowed, replacing the suspect component entirely, and logging everything in his shift report with production codes and photographs taken on his phone. When he tried to submit the report through the internal system, his account returned a permissions error he hadn't seen before, a flag that shouldn't have applied to his role. Malcolm said he would enter the after-hours request manually in the morning, that it was a system issue he'd encountered before, that Rhett shouldn't worry. Near dawn, working through the component's production markings under a work light, Rhett found a code he recognized, AC9, a designation he had seen on documents from the Tempest R development program, a project he had no formal access to. He photographed the marking, noted it in his personal log, and set the component aside where Malcolm would find it. The detail Malcolm did not know, the one that would surface days later, was that the internal system had been accessed by an administrator credential in the window between Rhett's failed submission and the morning shift, a credential that belonged to neither of them. Rhett left the building at 6:51 in the morning, with the Ferrari running clean behind him, drove home, showered, and discovered that the person scheduled to watch Mila had canceled. Not with explanation, simply a message that arrived as he was pulling on his jacket. He drove Mila to a relative's house, got caught in traffic on the bridge approach, and walked into Blackthorn Velocity Motors 47 minutes late, carrying nothing he could prove and nothing he intended to defend. The reversal began within minutes, but minutes, in cases of public humiliation, is already too long. Vivian heard Malcolm's account and turned to Laurel with the kind of controlled urgency that is more frightening than anger, the kind that says the problem has been identified and must now be corrected before it calcifies. Laurel confirmed what Vivian already knew in the part of her mind that had gone cold the moment she saw Malcolm's face. The system had no record, the termination had been processed, Rhett's access credentials had been deactivated within the standard automated window, and while the technical path to reversing it existed, the practical path to undoing the moment it represented did not. She could rescind the paperwork. She could not rescind the floor, watching Rhett Dawson walk out of a building he had served without a single absence for 6 years, carrying nothing but a scorched part and his silence. Vivienne called him directly. He didn't answer. She had her assistant send a formal message requesting an immediate meeting, framed as an urgent matter requiring his expertise. The response came through Malcolm an hour later, passed along without editorial comment in the way people relay things they are not fully comfortable saying. I'm not going back somewhere that needed to see my badge number or the car I fixed before it was willing to hear what I had to say. Vivienne sat down, set the message aside, and looked at the Ferrari, parked in the display bay now, returned from the morning run, and thought about everything the car had not told her, and everything she had not thought to ask. The launch event proceeded because there was no viable alternative. The partners were present, the agreements were drafted, and pulling back at that stage would have cost more in uncertainty than anything it might have saved. Vivian drove the Ferrari to the venue herself, as planned, and it ran exactly as Rhett had left it. Smooth, responsive, and quiet in the way an engine is quiet when someone has taken the time to fix it right, rather than just well enough to pass inspection. But she could not stop thinking about the component Malcolm had carried to her desk, could not stop turning over the implication that a part with no business being inside that car had been placed there by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and had been discovered and removed by someone who had then been fired the next morning before he could tell anyone why it mattered. Inside the venue, during the preliminary presentation of the Tempest R prototype, the thermal monitoring display registered an anomaly in the engine management system. Graham Prescott, the lead engineer, was standing close enough to see it and moved with practiced efficiency to silence the alert before any visiting partners noticed, then stood very still for the rest of the presentation with the expression of someone managing a calculation they do not yet have all the numbers for. Sterling Ashcombe, the COO, watched from across the room with the particular attentiveness of someone for whom this moment was not surprising, who had been watching for it. In fact, the way a navigator watches for a landmark they already know is coming. In the days that followed, Sterling guided the narrative in the controlled, elegant way he guided all things. Quietly, through suggestion, through the arrangement of emphasis rather than the statement of falsehood. He told Vivienne, and later the board, that Rhett was a skilled but disaffected technician, that the decision to stay late had not been selfless, and that a man who placed a mysterious component on the CEO's desk on his way out the door was making a statement rather than a report. He suggested the disruption could be contained, that the right move was to avoid elevating a grievance into an incident, and he mentioned, almost as an aside, that Ashcombe Performance Systems was prepared to take on the component validation work for Tempest R at a fraction of the current development timeline. Malcolm, meanwhile, was reviewing camera logs, and what the camera logs showed was a 12-minute gap in the overnight recording, precisely centered on the period when Rhett had removed and photographed the suspicious component, and that the access credential used to clear the after-hours overtime request belonged to a junior technical assistant who reported, in the organizational chart, directly to Sterling Ashcombe. Rhett returned to a house that had always been quieter than it should have been, the specific quiet that settles into a home designed for 4 people and now holding 2, and he sat at the kitchen table for a long time without doing much of anything. Mila came home from school and put her backpack down and looked at him with the attentiveness of a 13-year-old who has learned to read the room before she reads her homework, and asked, with the careful casualness that children use for questions they are afraid of, whether everything was okay. He told her the company had decided they didn't need him in the same way anymore, which was true in the narrowest sense, and that he was going to figure out the next move, which was also true, and that she didn't need to worry about the house, which was the only part he wasn't entirely certain of. She said okay, took her backpack upstairs, and he heard her start to draw, pencil on paper, the sound she made when she was processing something she wasn't ready to talk about. And he sat with that sound for a while before he started thinking about what came next. What came next was a phone call from Carradine Apex Automotive, arriving with the suspicious speed that follows a public dismissal in a small industry, where everyone watches everyone else's movements the way weather systems watch each other. The offer was detailed, generous, and structured in a way that suggested someone had spent considerable time thinking about exactly which number would make a single father with a mortgage say yes before he thought too hard about what he was agreeing to. Triple his current salary, a private research space, access to a high-performance development program, and a bonus structure tied to bringing certain technical knowledge with him from his previous role. Rhett listened to the entire offer and then said he wasn't interested in the last part. The caller said that was fine, that they weren't asking for anything improper, and that the offer stood regardless. He set the phone down and sat with the discomfort of knowing that the offer existed, that he hadn't fully closed the door, and that Mila's future was not going to grow on principles alone. 3 days after the termination, Vivian Blackthorne appeared at the small independent garage where Rhett had taken some diagnostic work to stay occupied, a place run by an old contact. Nothing glamorous, the kind of shop that smells like oil and decisions made under pressure. She came without her assistant, without a formal document, and without the particular armor she wore at the office, and she asked him to let her explain. He gave her the silence that people earn when they've done something that can't be walked back with intentions. She explained the missing system record, the pressure she'd been under, the fact that she had acted on information she should have verified. When she finished, he said, "Are you sorry because I fixed the car? Or because you found out you fired the wrong person?" The question sat between them longer than it should have, which told both of them something important. Vivienne said she was sorry because she had treated a decision about a person's livelihood the way she treated a production schedule, not out of malice, but still a mistake she had made. He did not agree to come back. He told her there were 4 questions she needed to answer before he was willing to set foot inside that building again. Who had deleted the overnight entry? Who had placed the foreign component in her father's car? What the marking AC9 meant in the context of the Tempest R project? And why a thermal warning on a prototype had been silenced without a log entry. Vivienne did not speak for a long moment. Then she said, "You know more than I do." And he said, "That shouldn't have been possible." They agreed on terms. Rhett would return to examine the Ferrari as an independent consultant, not an employee, with Malcolm present, every finding documented on his device as well as the company system, and no one authorized to modify the record. When Rhett ran the Ferrari's onboard memory that evening, he found a log entry he hadn't seen during the original repair. A record of the vehicle's proximity sensors being triggered in the secure parking bay at 2:13 in the morning, 3 days before the fault was reported. The car had been accessed, remotely unlocked, in the middle of the night by someone whose credentials the system had accepted without question. 4 people held authorized credentials for the private vehicle bay: Vivian herself, Malcolm, the head of facility security, and Sterling Ashcombe. Sterling, informed of the discovery during a meeting Vivian called that afternoon, offered the explanation that his credential card may have been duplicated without his knowledge, and noted that the security camera covering that bay entrance had experienced a technical gap on the relevant night. Unfortunate, he said, but not suspicious, because hardware failures in that wing were a documented issue. He said all of this with the smooth, considered timing of a man who has prepared for a conversation which Rhett noted and did not comment on, and which Vivienne stored in the part of her mind that was building an architecture of what she didn't yet know. Malcolm said nothing in that meeting, but afterward found Rhett in the bay and said 2 words he knew. The technical work that followed was the kind engineers do when the stakes have exceeded the normal professional calculus, and what remains is just the problem and the evidence. Rhett and Graham Prescott worked through the component comparison together. Graham reluctantly at first, with the caution of a man who understood that what they were likely to find would end a project he had spent 2 years building, and then with increasing precision as the data made denial too expensive to maintain. The component removed from the Ferrari was a reduced-scale version of the AC9 thermal management module currently installed in the Tempest R prototype. Same production architecture, same failure mode, the same tendency to produce erratic signal data under sustained load in a way that didn't surface in short-cycle testing, but would become dangerous on a sustained run. The Tempest R module had passed its certification cycle, according to the files on record. But the internal testing data, the numbers Graham had generated, not the numbers that appeared in submitted reports, showed a fault rate that no serious engineer would have accepted. Graham told Rhett, in the flat tone of someone who has been carrying a weight too long, that he had flagged the issue in writing 4 months earlier, and that the report had been returned by Sterling's office with a note that the data was insufficient to constitute a finding, and the project timeline didn't permit a full re-evaluation of the supplier. He had not escalated above Sterling because Sterling was the chain of command, and because, he paused, he had a family and a career and had made the calculation that most people make when the cost of speaking up appears greater than the cost of staying quiet. Rhett did not judge him for this because judging people for human calculation was not the work that needed doing. The picture assembling itself was precise and terrible, a foreign component placed inside a beloved car that was never supposed to fail publicly on the day the CEO was behind the wheel. The same component's parent module deployed inside a prototype positioned for a $300 million international agreement. Testing records falsified to suppress fault data, and the man who had discovered the first piece of this puzzle repaired it successfully and attempted to report it, removed from the building the following morning before his account could be heard. If the Ferrari had failed at the signing event, the narrative would have been unmistakable. Vivienne's own team couldn't maintain a 60-year-old classic. Her flagship prototype carried undisclosed technical risk, and the leadership responsible for both was no longer credible. The solution that would then have been offered, a new supplier, externally validated, with an existing certification record, was Ashcombe Performance Systems, the company in which Sterling held a private financial interest he had never disclosed to the board. Rhett looked at the component for a long time before saying anything, and what he said was quiet but precise. He didn't just try to embarrass her, he tried to make her a liability. Then, after a pause, and I was the one who got in the way, Vivienne, listening from the doorway, said nothing for a long moment. Then she asked him what he thought they should do. He said, "Stop the test that's scheduled for tomorrow morning." She asked why. He said, "Because the authorization on file has your signature on it, and you told me you never signed it." And she had. Vivienne stopped the test with a directive issued directly to the floor, bypassing Sterling's office entirely, and the prototype sat in the bay while the authorization question moved from a technical anomaly to a formal security matter in the span of about 40 minutes. Sterling arrived with the composure of someone who has planned for resistance and found it earlier than expected, and he made his argument in the conference room with the board liaison present. The test was scheduled. The partners had been informed a delay at this stage would introduce doubt into a deal 72 hours from closing, and the available evidence for any irregularity was circumstantial at best and originated with a recently terminated employee who was, Sterling noted with careful emphasis, currently in active conversation with Carradine Apex. He was not wrong about this last point, and the room felt it. Rhett was asked to present his findings directly to the board liaison because Vivienne understood, with the clarity that arrives when the stakes become existential, that she could not be the sole voice in this room, that if she was the one making the case, Sterling could reframe the entire situation as a leadership dispute between two executives, and the board would do what boards always do when they sense instability: choose certainty over correctness. Rhett stood in front of the room with no presentation, slides and no interest in the political geometry of what he was walking into, and laid out the data: thermal failure rates, signal deviation timelines, the physical evidence from the Ferrari component, the chain of access logs, the 12-minute camera gap, the deleted overtime entry. He said, "Don't take my word for it. Take the numbers that were paid for and then buried." Graham Prescott confirmed the testing data from his own records. The board liaison asked, with the measured skepticism that distinguishes questions people ask when they want to know from questions asked when they want to dismiss, what credibility a recently dismissed mechanic, carried in a technical assessment of this magnitude. Rhett said, "The credibility of a man who found this problem before anyone in this building was looking for it." Sterling presented what he had learned about Rhett's conversations with Carradine Apex, documented, factual, and which Rhett had never disclosed. He framed the arc with the economy of a skilled narrator. A disaffected technician, denied advancement, reaches out to a competitor, creates a crisis using access to a valuable vehicle, positions himself as the expert who resolved it, gains proximity to the CEO, then introduces technical risk into a sensitive procurement decision in a way that, by remarkable coincidence, benefits the competitor he had been negotiating with. It was a story built entirely from true pieces that assembled into a false picture, and Vivienne felt the room moving toward it the way rooms move toward explanations that ask less of everyone. Rhett said, "I talked to them. I didn't sign anything, and I didn't share anything belonging to this company." Vivienne asked why he hadn't told her. He looked at her steadily and said, "You ended my employment. What I did with my time after that wasn't yours to review." The distance between them returned in that moment, clean and sharp, and both of them felt it. Malcolm's voice cut through from the corner, where he had been standing with a tablet showing a batch verification record. The AC9 component from the Ferrari bore a microstamp corresponding to a test lot that Ashcombe Performance Systems had certified as destroyed 8 months prior. Sterling looked at the tablet. For the first time in the meeting, he said nothing for several seconds, and that silence was its own kind of answer. Malcolm spoke to the board for 22 minutes without notes, which was the kind of testimony that carries weight precisely because it is unpolished, because the person giving it is not managing a narrative, just reporting what happened. He described the night Rhett stayed, the call, the reluctance, the arrangements made so that a man with a 13-year-old daughter could come back to a bay floor at 7 in the evening and work until nearly 7 in the morning on a car that wasn't his for a woman he had never spoken to, because the shop manager asked him to, and because that was the kind of person he was. He described the system error that prevented Rhett from submitting his own overtime record, the promise he'd made to enter it manually in the morning, and arriving the following day to find the termination already in process, the record gap already present, and the decision already irreversible in the way that public decisions always are, regardless of the paperwork. And then he said something the room needed to hear in plain language, without ceremony. Someone knew Rhett would be late that morning. They knew before he did. Laurel Winslow had spent the prior 2 days auditing the HR trail, driven partly by professional obligation and partly by the particular discomfort of someone who has signed a document they are no longer confident in. What she found was a sequence that does not occur naturally. The tardiness report on Rhett had been created as a system entry at 7:12 in the morning, 35 minutes before he walked through the door. The termination form template had metadata showing it had been populated the previous evening, before the overnight shift had even ended. Sterling's technical assistant had submitted a digital request for attendance monitoring on Rhett's specific employee ID at 11:47 the night before, and the inbound call Rhett had placed to the facility, the one he made from his car while running late, the call that Vivienne never received, had been routed to a general queue and flagged as low priority by a setting modified earlier that same morning. This was not impulsive. This was built. Someone had known Rhett would finish the overnight work, had known his childcare arrangement could become unpredictable, had known the system gap would leave him without documentation, and had designed a corridor of decision points that would lead Vivienne to the conclusion she reached without anyone needing to lie to her directly. Sterling had not created the childcare problem. He was not responsible for a caregiver canceling, but the backup care service Rhett used was managed through a vendor network that, Laurel later confirmed, shared a procurement relationship with an Ashcombe subsidiary. Whether the cancellation was manufactured or merely convenient, the preparation built around it was deliberate. Vivian sat with this in a way that required something more demanding than anger. It required her to follow the chain of causation past Sterling and into her own choices, to identify the exact moments where she had handed operational authority to a man whose loyalty she had accepted at surface value because the alternative was spending attention she had allocated elsewhere. She had given Sterling control over procurement validation because she was managing the financing structure for the $300 million agreement and had trusted the process to hold. She had signed off on the Ashcombe contract expansion without reviewing the supplier disclosure forms personally, because her desk had been carrying 4 simultaneous crises, and that one had looked clean in summary. She said this to the board, not as a defense, not as an accusation of Sterling, but as an accounting of her own. She said, "I signed the termination. Sterling manipulated the data, but I was the one who chose not to verify." One of the board members looked at her the way people look at someone doing something unexpected, and nobody said anything for a moment. Then Sterling said, with the composure of a man who still believes he holds the final card, that an admission of process failure was not the same as a path forward, that the company still needed a decision about the test run and the partnership and the supplier, and that none of those decisions could wait for an investigation that might take weeks. He said, "The deal doesn't close without me." And he was, technically, not wrong. Because he had spent 2 years building himself into the architecture of the agreement, which had been, Rhett understood now, the point all along. The board gave Vivian the choice in the terms it always presents itself. The safe path that preserves the existing deal and requires looking away, or the correct path that disrupts everything and might cost the company more than anyone was sure it could absorb. Several members made the argument that no vehicle had actually failed, that the Ferrari had been repaired before anyone was hurt, that the module in the Tempest R had not yet produced an incident, and that a 6-week delay announced proactively was categorically different from a defect disclosed under legal obligation. One member said, with the authority of someone who has survived difficult quarters before, "We can replace the part quietly and protect the timeline." Another said, "We have no legal obligation to disclose a potential issue that exists only in internal testing." Rhett did not have a fortune to offer and did not pretend otherwise. He was a mechanic who had spent a night fixing a car and found something in it he couldn't unfind. What he had was a technical proposal: replace the AC9 module across the entire Tempest R system, delay the launch by 6 weeks, commission an independent validation from a third-party testing house, source replacement components from a supplier with no connection to any current executive, invite the international partners to observe the validation process directly, and disclose the delay in terms that described a quality enhancement rather than a defect correction. It was expensive, slow, and honest. It was the difference between a company that survived a crisis by managing it, and a company that survived one by pretending it hadn't happened until it happened loudly enough to be unavoidable. Vivian looked at the board and made the call without theatrical buildup, in the same direct tone she had used to fire Rhett Dawson, which was, he noted quietly, the most appropriate possible symmetry. Sterling Ashcombe was suspended from operational duties pending an independent investigation into procurement irregularities, unauthorized system access, falsification of certification data, and an undisclosed financial relationship with Ashcombe Performance Systems. Sterling's composure broke for the first and only time in that room. He said she was making a decision that would end her tenure, that the board could not survive the stock response to a voluntary delay of this scale, that she was handing the company to people who didn't understand what they were protecting. She looked at him for a moment without the performance of strength that powerful people sometimes use to demonstrate they are not afraid, and said, "If keeping this seat requires me to put an unsafe vehicle on the road, you can have the seat." What happened next was not the catastrophe Sterling had promised. The international partners, reached directly by Vivienne within the hour, did not withdraw. They were already in possession of data suggesting Ashcombe Performance Systems had also provided them with specification documents that didn't fully match the components in the delivery pipeline, a discrepancy they had been internally debating how to raise for 3 weeks. They agreed to the voluntary delay, welcomed the independent validation, and proposed a modified agreement structure that actually strengthened Blackthorn's position by removing Ashcombe from the supply chain entirely. The deal did not die. It changed shape, and the change was better than what it replaced. The email that Malcolm found in Sterling's recovered files 3 days later was the final piece, a message sent to a senior contact at Caradine Apex 11 months earlier, describing a plan to create the conditions under which Vivienne Blackthorn would be replaced by a board-appointed interim team, at which point the Tempest R project rights would be transferred at a valuation, reflecting a company in crisis rather than one on the verge of a major international partnership. Sterling had not been trying to run Blackthorn. He had been trying to break it and sell the pieces. The formal findings took 3 weeks, and by the end of them, Sterling Ashcombe had been removed from the company, stripped of his performance bonuses, removed from every governance structure his name had touched, and referred to an external legal body for investigation into corporate fraud, falsification of safety documentation, and conflict of interest violations that would take considerably longer to resolve than a board meeting. He did not go loudly. He went the way men like him always go when the documentation catches up, with a statement from his legal team and no further comment. The public record was corrected with the speed that public records are corrected when it becomes legally prudent to do so, and the company's official communication confirmed that Rhett Dawson had performed an authorized after-hours repair on the evening in question, that his employee record had been subject to unauthorized alteration, that the termination decision had been made on the basis of falsified information, and that the decision was formally rescinded. Vivienne announced the creation of a new role, Director of Technical Safety, independent of the operational chain of command, and offered it to Rhett directly, in writing, with terms that reflected what the position actually required rather than what was administratively convenient. Rhett read the offer and sat with it the same way he sat with things that mattered, quietly for long enough to know what he actually thought. Then he replied, not with a refusal and not with an acceptance, but with a set of conditions that made the offer real rather than ceremonial. He said, no employee could be terminated without a direct response window of at least 48 hours. After-hours work authorizations had to be confirmed through 2 independent systems, not one. Safety reports could not be routed through the same chain of command as the department under review. Whistleblower protections had to be codified in the employment contract, not left to the policy handbook, and technical go or no-go decisions on active vehicles could not be tied to financial incentive structures for the decision-makers. Vivienne agreed to all 5 conditions and brought them to the board as part of the governance reform package she announced the same week. The apology, the real one, not the formal letter from the legal team, happened in the production bay, in front of the same people who had watched Rhett walk out 3 weeks before. Vivienne walked to the center of the floor and spoke the way she should have spoken the morning of the termination, which is to say, by acknowledging a failure before explaining it. She said she had seen a man arrive late on the most important day of a business she was responsible for, and had treated the tardiness as the entire story, and that was a failure in judgment she owned without qualification. Not because Sterling had manipulated the information, though he had, but because she had not thought to look past it. She said, "I saw a man walk in late and didn't ask what he'd done before he got there. That was mine." The floor was quiet. Rhett, standing to the side, did not make the moment about himself. He accepted the role as an independent consultant with a 6-month review and a formal agreement that either party could restructure the arrangement at that point without penalty. Because a job title didn't repair a culture, and the culture was still new enough to the changes being asked of it that it needed to prove them, not just announce them. 6 months later, Blackthorn Velocity Motors looked like a company that had survived something and knew it. The Tempest R had passed independent validation and received certification from 2 separate testing bodies, both noting in their reports that the thermal management system performed at the high end of its class and showed none of the failure modes documented in the suppressed internal data. The AC-9 modules were gone, replaced, recalled, and removed from every vehicle in the pre-production pipeline. The Ashcombe Performance Systems contract had been formally terminated, and the relationship disclosed to the board in a filing that would remain in the governance record. Malcolm had been given expanded autonomy over the technical sign-off process, which he exercised with the same careful stubbornness he brought to everything. Laurel had rebuilt the disciplinary process from the intake form up, adding verification steps that required a second authorization for any same-day termination. Graham had presented his suppressed testing data to the engineering committee in a full session and then, with visible relief, gone back to the work of building cars he actually trusted. Rhett had settled into something that looked, from the outside, like a quiet life, and was, from the inside, the first version of a stable life he had been able to maintain since his wife died. He was at the shop most mornings before anyone else, which was habit, and at Mila's school events most evenings, which was priority. And those 2 facts had, for the first time in years, stopped being in conflict with each other. He had started a training program for younger technicians. Not formal, not credentialed, just an open bay afternoon twice a week, where anyone who wanted to learn how to diagnose a problem by listening to it was welcome to show up. The blackened AC-9 component sat in a glass case on the shelf above his workstation, kept not as a grievance but as a reminder, in the same way that certain things deserve to stay visible, not because you celebrate them, but because forgetting them costs more than keeping them does. On a Thursday morning in early spring, Vivian brought the Ferrari back to the bay and said it was making a sound. Rhett listened to the engine at idle, at moderate load, and at high throttle, then let it run for a few minutes without saying anything before he told her the car was completely fine. She looked at him for a moment and said, quietly, that she knew, that she had just wanted to know whether he was still willing to look at it. He held that for a moment and said, "Are you going to fire me if I tell you that you were worried for no reason?" She said she had learned to ask the floor manager first. From the far end of the bay, Malcolm said, without looking up from the engine he was working on, that this time the man had only shown up on schedule. Vivienne offered Rhett the keys. He said the car wasn't his to drive. She said she knew, but she was offering anyway. He sat behind the wheel for a long moment, the warm leather, the smell of oil and old aluminum, the photograph of her father fastened to the sun visor, and he said, "Nobody inherits the right to something like this. You have to earn it every time you pick up the keys." She got in beside him. The Ferrari rolled out of the bay into the pale morning light, and this time nobody had stayed up through the night to keep a hidden fault from becoming a disaster. The car ran clean because the work had been done right. The records had been kept honest, and the people responsible for it had finally agreed to stop looking away from what was in front of them.